Welcome to the Nexus Life podcast series, where members of Nexus Chambers discuss all things law. My name is Lynton Orrett. I am a barrister at Nexus Chambers, specialising in criminal law, inquests and inquiries. The title of today's podcast is Black Lives Matter, COVID-19 and the Way Forward. I am happy to have with me today my colleague in Chambers, the esteemed barrister, Mr.
Brian Richardson, and I'm delighted to be with you as well, Lynton.
No problem. Brian, what's your specialisation in Chambers?
I practice primarily in criminal defence.
Now, the reasons we're here. Lockdown came, we were all in it together until we weren't. And now, on top of that, we have to consider 846, the way matters on that day and those events have led us to a refreshed, reinvigorated Black Lives Matter movement. Can I start with the lockdown, Brian?
Well, as you quite rightly said in your introduction, Lynton, we're living in extraordinary times, probably the most extraordinary times that any of us will have lived through. And I think it was clear when we went into lockdown, and it's certainly clear now as we're beginning to emerge out of lockdown, that we're not going to return to business as usual. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about us being all in it together, because of course that was the mantra that was trotted out repeatedly by the people in power and authority. But as the pandemic continued, as it spread, as lockdown continued, it became increasingly clear that the people who were becoming critically ill and dying as a result were disproportionately from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and that the people on the front line in terms of having to try and cope with it, the people who were looking after us as doctors, nurses, transport workers, care workers, cleaners and so on, were disproportionately from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And I think it really, in a profound way, raised the question of whether we really are all in it together, whether we are all really suffering in it together. And what probably characterised the inequality more than anything else was the fact that Dominic Cummings, the chief advisor to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, somebody who sits on the advisory body that made the regulations that almost all of us have complied with, that he was able to take his family from London all the way up to County Durham at a time when his wife was suffering from COVID-19 and he was showing symptoms. He was able to simply break the regulations and travel all of that way in order to protect his family. And indeed, on the very day that he took that notorious trip to Barnard Castle, supposedly to test his eyesight, that day, I know, because I live in Brixton, that the park that is nearest to me, Brockwell Park in Brixton, and it was a beautiful day, it was Easter Sunday, that park was closed by the local council and the police because they decided that the previous day too many people had been in there exercising for too long. I think the real reason people were in there is because you have in areas like Brixton and surrounding areas, you have disproportionate numbers of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds and working class people who don't have nice big gardens that they can exercise in, that they can maintain social distancing in, that they can get away from the pressures that you have in the home. And so they don't have the freedom and the opportunities that rich, privileged people have. And of course, interestingly, you look at the figures that are emerging now, and it's clear that under the Coronavirus Act, disproportionate numbers of people from Black communities have been stopped and searched and have been fined, whereas Dominic Cummings, the police said they believe he committed an offence, but decided to take no further action against him. It really does raise the question of, are we really all in it together?
I have to agree with you 100% there, because I know South London, and if you're living in Angel Town or Stockwell Park Estate or Myattsfield Estate, you have no communal space, not really. You have flats that are very close together. The walls are incredibly thin. And even at the best of times, it can be stressful to live there. Yeah. So areas like Rockwell Park are essential. So when you see someone like Dominic Cummings getting away with saying that on his wife's birthday, which happened to fall on Easter Sunday, yes, he's testing his eyesight by driving to an idyllic location, spending time by the river, going from the river, then going to a wood where you then play with your son. So you're testing your eyesight is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So that I know, talking to my son and people of his age, set off something in them. This is, well, if it doesn't apply to him, there's no way it can still apply to me.
Yeah.
Now, hopefully, Dominic Cummings won't get away with that. And I know that Mike Mansfield in our chambers has been instructed to support a challenge against that. Mm. But even though that's all well and good, it did show starkly how this government really only protected Dominic Cummings. Now, for those people who were arrested, a lot we know were arrested falsely. We know that the regulations have not been applied evenly. What can they do, or what as lawyers can we do for them?
Well, you mentioned, Lynton, the judicial review, I think it is, that has been initiated about the decision not to take any action against Dominic Cummings. And obviously that, on a macro level, if you like, is really important, because it will raise the question of the legality of that decision, and depending on the outcome, it may lead to something happening with regard to Dominic Cummings. But I suppose, if you like, it has an implication, doesn't it, on the lower level, in that if it can be shown that there's that kind of discretion in terms of the imposition of the provisions of the Coronavirus Act, then it opens up the possibility for those people who have been subjected to sanctions already, fines and the like. It opens up the possibility of them challenging those things. And I think that certainly we as lawyers and as a chambers have to be open and ready and available to offer assistance to people who want to challenge that. The Coronavirus Act had to be passed very quickly. It was passed hastily with very little legislative scrutiny and so on. So it may well be that there are legal challenges that ought to be made to the Coronavirus Act, and if it gets renewed, there will need to be more legal scrutiny, which is something that we ought to be prepared to be involved in.
When I was reading the regulations and their updates, what I've realised is this government's ever-increasing use of statutory instruments, which don't have to be looked at by Parliament. I think we should be scrutinising from now on, not just what the government is saying and doing, but also in all areas, whether this government is actually undermining our democracy by the increased use of these statutory instruments. It's something which I think is being overlooked because there are so many other pressing issues that we need to deal with.
I think it's a very important point, Lynton, and we rightly have to focus on some of the immediate things, but we shouldn't take our eye off these bigger issues and think about what the longer term implications of these things are, because you're right, the increasing use of statutory instruments is a very real concern. I think that it has raised in many people's eyes a real sense of not just, are we all in it together, but do these people represent us in any serious way? I think that there is a link between people feeling frustrated and fed up with them being told, you can't go out, you can't exercise, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other, and the rich and powerful being able to go off and do whatever they want, and the sudden eruption of people out onto the streets on the Black Lives Matter protests.
I think there's a link that we still have to add in before we get to the Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And that is, while we are being told to stay at home, there's a very important sector of society which has to go to work.
Yeah.
It's our NHS workers, the support workers, our London transport workers, who, when we look at Bangladeshi, African, Caribbean, generally people from minority groupings in this country, have suffered the most. So we've seen the reports of doctors from those backgrounds dying the most, health workers dying the most, bus drivers, out of all the people who do public transport, dying the most. What do you think caused that to happen? For Black people and Bangladeshi people in particular, so African, Caribbean, Bangladeshi in particular, to be overrepresented in those deaths?
I think there are a number of factors there. I think there are some specific things in terms of the National Health Service. And amongst those specific things are the fact that the National Health Service, from its inception, from 1948, when it was first founded, it was built by people from all over the world, by doctors and nurses and support workers who were invited to come here to what was called the mother country, invited from Britain's colonies to come and help rebuild the mother country in the aftermath of the devastation of the Second World War. So it has always been the case that you've had a disproportionate percentage of the workforce have been from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, the Caribbean, and so on. Indeed, it's interesting, isn't it, that back in the early 1960s, Enoch Powell was a health minister and was responsible for one of the schemes that resulted in the recruitment of over 10, maybe 15,000 doctors from India and Pakistan to come and work here. The same Enoch Powell who in 1968 made the astonishing and outrageous Rivers of Blood speech that really catapulted him into the top rank of leading racist figures. And it's always been the case that you've had those numbers of people. I think 44% of doctors from in the minority ethnic backgrounds, 20% of other staff in the health service. And so that is a particular story and an important reason why I think the claps for health service workers was really important in terms of explaining and getting people to recognise that. But within that, the discrimination, even for people who are professionals, the most well-qualified, if you like, medics, disproportionate numbers of those doctors, consultants even, were on the front line. They were the ones who were having to deal with the patients who were becoming critically ill and dying. And that tells a story of discrimination within the health service. Beyond that, and you're right, transport workers, tube workers, cleaners. I think when, delivery drivers had such an important role to play. And here you have a situation where, these are people who are in the lowest paid work. And precisely because of that, they're the people who necessarily had to go to work. They couldn't afford to stay at home, and they weren't in the kind of jobs where They could work from home anyway. And I think that more than these claims about us eating the wrong thing or having underlying health conditions, those social and economic factors are far more significant.
Well, the Public Health England, in the initial report that came out, where they've withheld a big exception, but in a little bit they did reveal that they said that the increase in fatalities can't just be down to existing comorbidities, because they existed beforehand, and the death rate is higher than that for COVID. So it can't just be comorbidities. It has to be something about maybe the lack of PPE for those people who are on that. The nurses' union saying, well, we've said for years that there is discrimination at the lower levels of nursing. The way we perceive nurses and doctors. For example, the head of the nursing, I've forgotten her name, the nursing union, she was on TV the other day. He's a professor. There was another guy who is also a professor. When they gave this title, the guy had the word professor. She just had her name. And that, to me, was a stark illustration of what happens on a much more in-depth level, day in, day out. So we have people staying at home, locked up, not being able to see loved ones. We have the frustrations then of a very privileged, well-educated, well-off man at the centre of government, having the arms of government wrapped around him. We have working class, predominantly working class people dying in the NHS. Those who aren't, but they're from certain minority groups, are exceptionally dying. And then we have a spark where on our TV, on our YouTube, everywhere, we see a man arrested, peacefully taken into custody, not resisting, on the floor with a policeman knee on his neck. That policeman has his hands in his pocket. He has glasses up on the top of his head, and he casually, for 8 minutes, 46 seconds, keeps that knee on that man's life until he dies. Why do you think that death has had such an impact?
I think there are a number of reasons. Firstly, as you've just described, the nature of that killing was so graphic, and it was so harrowing, wasn't it, to see somebody for, as you say, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And, there's something incredibly harrowing, isn't there, about seeing a man, 46, so not in the first flush of youth, crying out for his dead mother and begging, "I can't breathe," as that police officer throttled the life out of him. That was an incredibly harrowing thing to see, and I think created massive anger. But of course, we know, don't we, that wasn't the first time that someone was filmed dying in that manner. It happened to Eric Garner in 2014 in New York. Exactly the same words. "I can't breathe" 11 times. I think with George Floyd it was 16 times. And for what offences? Eric Garner allegedly selling loose cigarettes. George Floyd allegedly trying to pass off a counterfeit $20 note. Coming, of course, on the back of other deaths. Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old woman dying a few months ago. Ahmed Armory, jogging away, grabbed and killed. And so I think there was that sense of anger and fury that is the immediate catalyst. But undoubtedly, there is a connection with COVID-19. I think it was the lightning rod, what happened to George Floyd, for a whole sense of anger and fury and frustration with life And the combination with lockdown is people are saying, we're not going back to that. That after lockdown, we're not having that anymore. And therefore, even with everything that we were told, that you're not allowed to protest, you have to maintain social distancing and so on, people who are saying enough is enough just erupted onto the streets. And I think it has been quite extraordinary and amazing to see it spread, not just right across the states, yet the biggest revolts, bigger, some people are arguing, than 68 in the aftermath of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. But it's extraordinary to see those revolts spreading all across the world, including here in Britain.
And I think, unlike 1968, the speed with which they've spread, this lockdown has meant people aren't distracted. And because they're not distracted, they've been able to focus on the world around them. So normally, when a police murder happens in the way it did, we're working. We're going to the gym. Their colleagues are going to uni. They're doing 1,000 things, which is, in my belief, one of the reasons why campaigners who have been talking about systemic racism since the 60s, at least, haven't made as much headway as they would have hoped. I think you have both been around for long enough to know none of this is new.
No.
We've seen it before. But this time people had the time. They had the time to watch, to think, and to listen. So we have a Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter, and we have people out demonstrating in a time of COVID. You got any advice for people who have demonstrated and now are facing trial?
Well, I promise you I'm going to come on to that, Lynton. But I just want to go back a little bit in terms of what you were saying, because it is worth reminding ourselves, not simply that people like you and I who've been around the block have been arguing these things for decades, really. It's worth remembering, and obviously for us, there's a link with our chambers, because Imran Khan, QC, and Michael Mansfield were involved in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, representing Doreen Lawrence. And the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the inquiry was 98, the report was published in 1999, was profoundly important in terms of finally recognising some of the things that people like us had been arguing since the 60s. I was arguing since the 60s. I was only born in the 60s, but
I was born, so it's okay.
Our predecessors, Lynton, who developed the concept of institutional racism to describe the way in which it's structured into society rather than simply being about the relationships between individuals. And we'll both remember that back in 1982, when Lord Scarman reported on the Brixton riots, he talked about there just being a few bad apples in an otherwise wholesome barrel. Rejecting the arguments that were put then about institutional racism. 1999, we won that argument. Aftermath of that report, many people thought, this is it. We're going to see a transformation. People talked about a step change in society's attitude towards race relations, and it didn't happen. So here we are in 2020, and suddenly Black Lives Matter emerging. In a way, even that, if you think about the end of the 60s, people talked about Black Power. That was the phrase on people's lips. It sounds almost desperate that we're saying, we're almost pleading Black Lives Matter is a sign of how far back things have gone. But at least it's back on the agenda. And I think you're right, that because people have not been distracted by other things and have had time to think and to do some reading and to think about some of the things that are happening, it's created a new opportunity for us. Now, I've been on 3 or 4 of the big demonstrations that there have been in London, and I think that the mix of people have been astonishing. Well, it's worth remembering as well, isn't it, that there have been these arguments about the statutes and so on. People causing criminal damage, dragging the statue of Edward Colston off its plinth and throwing it in the river. The bigger crime is what Edward Colston did during the slave trade, and what that meant to thousands upon thousands of people. And actually, the fact that they did that in Bristol has, of course, stimulated this whole debate and discussion about monuments, about history, about decolonising the curriculum, and what the role of history is. To come back to your question, I think that we as lawyers have to be brave enough to take those arguments into the courtrooms. And so, get on to, some of the real issues about, why people are on those protests. I mean, it reminds me a little bit, actually, of the hearings last year around the environment and the climate catastrophe that we're facing, because I was only involved in one of the trials of an Extinction Rebellion protester, but it was a trial that had a number of defendants in it. For most of them, what mattered was not whether or not they were found guilty or not of the offence that they were charged with. Most of them were prepared to say, yes, I knew that I was breaking the law, but actually I was fighting against a bigger crime, and the bigger crime was the devastation of our environment that is taking place. And I want my voice heard in court. I want my day in court so I can put these things on the agenda. And I think that for many people around this whole question of the statutes, that's exactly how they'll feel. And we should be prepared to give voice to that. And I think that's what some of the best lawyers of our and other generations, people like Michael, did. They were prepared to go that extra mile. And I think that that's something we should be prepared to do as well.
I agree.
Yeah.
Really inspired me is the younger generation of lawyers. We've got a few in our chambers who've written about them. Omran has, James has. That's Omran Belhardy and James Nieto. They've both written about this matter.
Yeah.
And they also led the way in putting out our statement of support, which I know in some chambers has been difficult, and now it's on the breathe. How do you think we, individually and as a chambers, can support those people who are really pushing the Black Lives Matter movement? What do you think we can do?
I think, well, obviously in an immediate sense, if people are facing proceedings as a result of their participation in the protests and demonstrations, then we should be prepared to offer them any legal advice, support, representation that we can. We should, absolutely, definitely do that. I know that, where demonstrations have taken place, and I think those demonstrations will continue to happen. There are obviously practical things that we can do in terms of providing legal observers and things like that. We should definitely do that. And I think that because, as well, it's questions of justice are being raised, I think we should certainly be looking to put on events where we discuss history, politics, the law and so on, that helps to provide support and assistance and education for a new generation. We have to play our role in terms of widening opportunity for people. Interesting, I was talking to my partner about this the other day, and she was asking me about whether there is institutional racism in she asked me about the criminal justice system. And I said, yes, absolutely. Have a look at the report that David Lammy wrote back in 2017. And Lammy's report didn't even consider the question of stop and search. There was a separate report about stop and search that highlighted the hugely disproportionate impact that has. And that, of course, was a report that only came about because groups like the United Families and Friends campaign fought for and demanded it. And brilliant campaigners like Marcia Rigg demanded that report be written, and we should, find ways of supporting all of those kind of people, plugging them on our website, tweeting about them when they have campaigns and so on.
Right, last subject before we go. Inquiry.
Yeah.
Should be a public inquiry into the government's handling of this situation?
I think there will be anyway. I don't think there's any doubt. And I think from very early in the pandemic, people said, because it's had such a profound effect, so in terms of people's health, socially, economically, and so on, I don't think there's any doubt that there will be an inquiry. The bigger... Sorry?
I'm not so sure.
Right.
The reason I'm not so sure is this government seemed to be setting up more discreet, like the Public Health England one.
Yeah.
That's looking into, or supposed to look into PPE, things like that. The Equalities Commission is doing one on race and COVID. The government has now announced they're doing a new discrete institutional racism or systemic racism inquiry. My fear is what they are going to do is just have small, discrete inquiries and say, we've covered what we need to do, we've learnt the lessons, they're there for everybody to see because of the results of what, say, for example, Public Health England do. But they don't join up the dots. Each area is discrete. What would your argument be if the government tried to say, we have had these little inquiries, so we don't need a public inquiry? What arguments would you use to stop that argument?
Well, I think, Lynton, I think you're right that they would prefer not to have an inquiry, and that they will try to argue that these various little things that are happening are enough and that they're learning the lessons. I'm not convinced they'll get away with it. One of the things I think that has been astonishing has been the extent to which time and time again they've been forced onto the defensive, and they've been forced to introduce, almost everything: the furlough scheme, the scheme for self-employed people, the retreat on whether schools should reopen on June the 1st. Even, as we sit here speaking, they've announced within a day, haven't they, Marcus Rashford talking about how he was the beneficiary of free school meals. Boris Johnson has retreated and said, yes, actually, they will provide free school meals for school children over the summer months. I think that the groundswell has been so great that they've been forced to retreat time and time again. And therefore, if they try to argue we don't really need a public inquiry, they could well be pushed back. People remember the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, but the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was in many ways the exception, wasn't it, rather than the rule. It was the one where there was a headline-grabbing outcome, but I think it was not because that's what the government particularly wanted. I think it was because of the way that inquiry unfolded and the fact that, and Michael and Imran can describe it better than I can. I remember going to some of the days of the inquiry, but I wasn't there for the whole thing. But what was remarkable about it was the way in which literally day after day after day you had people from the community coming and supporting the Lawrences and giving their perspective. So it was almost like a set-piece play where you would have the chief executive of some local authority or the police or whatever turning up and saying, we're not racist, and would pull out of their briefcase some dust-covered copy of a policy document which supposedly showed that they weren't racist. And then afterwards, you'd have people from the community saying, did you see the dust flying off that document? That shows you how much it really means. Our real experience in Brixton, in Wood Green, in Moss Side, in Chapeltown, is of discrimination. And so Macpherson himself said it was the weight of opinion, constantly repeated time and time again, that forced him to that conclusion. And I think the challenge from the bottom up, and we as a chambers and progressive lawyers have to be part of this process, is to say we want a proper, fully independent public inquiry, and we want a real inquiry that examines all of the issues, including front and centre the issue of disproportionality and the impact it's had on Black communities. We are going to demand that there is that kind of inquiry and ensure that those issues are heard. The challenge for us is to not be defeatist. I think that our communities, Black and white communities, have been incredibly creative and dogged and determined in forcing some of the concessions that we've seen over the last couple of months. And we have to be equally determined to build on that to ensure that we get the kind of inquiry that we deserve.
And with that resounding message, we've come to an end.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you, Lynton.